In this video, I'm going to show you how to artificially create shallow depth of field by blurring specific parts of the background or the foreground so that we can focus on our focal point. This picture was originally shot in shallow depth of field with my DSLR camera. And then these pictures were shot with deep depth of field with my DSLR camera. One of them is a little bit more focused on the front, and the other one is focused a little bit more on the back. It's more complicated to make a shallow depth of field design artificially when we're trying to shoot past an object, but it can be very rewarding. So I'm going to focus on how to do that so that our image looks more like this, with nice blurry foreground and background and a very sharp middle ground. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I always like to come to the layers palette, and I will click and drag and create a duplicate for my background. That way I always have a copy that I can double check against. So I'm going to hide that one because that one's going to be my front layer so that I can double check to see if my changes have actually done anything worthwhile. Now, the next thing you're going to do is I'm going to go back to the one that I want to work on. I'm going to create a copy. And on this one, I am going to create a mask over it. Now the mask, what it is down in our layers palette. We can see that we have a couple of different functions here. We have a trash can, we have a new layer, we have a folder to put everything in, and then we have a raster mask. So I'm going to create a raster mask. So when I click on that, what happens is up in my layers palette, you can see that it has this white box, and I have a little marquee box around it. You can see that I'm switching on it, and what that means is that I'm either editing the picture or I'm editing the mask. So I'm going to come to the picture right now. And in the top bar, I'm going to come up to Filter. We'll click Filter, and we'll come down to our blur gallery. And then you have a bunch of different options for blurring, but I personally prefer the Gaussian blur. So I'll click on that, and that's going to bring up a little menu that I can change the radius of how blurry it is. And you can already see that it's made quite a difference on my blur. So if I raise this up a lot, you'll see that it'll get so blurry that we can't see things. We don't necessarily want it to look like that. I just want enough blur that it's going to look interesting. So I'm actually pretty happy with this amount right here. And I'm going to press OK. You can see that it's blurred out my entire image. But compared to my original image, that's a big shift. Now to the very tricky part, how we start returning the focus back to this so that we have blur in the other two areas. So in my layers palette, remember I showed you that we have this mask and that we can click off for the picture or onto the mask. I want you to click onto the mask so that that's highlighted. And what the mask does is a mask hides things. If it's white, imagine like a light being turned on. It means that it's showing. So since this is all white, the entire background, the entire picture is showing. But if I turn it black, then it will hide it. And the way that we turn it black is by using our tools in the toolbar. We can either use things like the brush tool or the paint bucket tool. We can even use a gradient, but that's a little bit trickier. What I'm going to do is I'm going to change to my brush tool. I like making sure that I have a soft edge, so I don't want my hardness up. And we can change the size by either moving it here, or if I press the bracket keys just over the Enter key or Return key, that'll make it larger or smaller. So I'm going to zoom back out. I'm going to make sure that my brush color is set to black. And then I'm going to paint. Notice how I am painting on this with black, but remember what I'm actually doing, painting black on this on the layer mask, and black hides and white shows. So I am hiding the blur, which is allowing me to show what exists under it. And what is under it is the original picture that has no blur. And you can see that this is kind of difficult. I am trying to keep the negative space in my original image blurry while making my middle ground nice and sharp. Now my middle ground is the image, but it's also a little bit of the ground. Remember that it's in the entire ground level that turns sharp. So you can see that I'm dodging around objects in the foreground and trying to make sure that I get the detail in the middle ground, both on the camera but on the ground itself. I have to dodge around the wires that came to the foreground, as well as I have to dodge around any other parts that are moving forward or back in my scene. Kind of tricky to get a really nice blur artificially, but because we are working on a mask and not making our design necessarily permanent, it can turn out really nice, and we can erase things as necessary by changing to white. So after I get this done, which looks pretty good, but we can see that I have a couple areas, specifically if we kind of look in over here, this looks really bad. But I'm going to change my brush now to white. Now remember, white shows, black hides. So when I'm on the brush tool, you can see that I'm going back in, and I am cleaning up those edges where I messed up on, putting those blurs back where the blurs belong, and avoiding the areas that are being hidden. And this can take a while, so that's why I encourage you guys to shoot with good settings first, and then do a little amount of editing, so you're not spending your entire time editing things. I think that it's changing things a little bit too much, so I'm going to change my opacity so that it only is slightly putting down a little bit of the white. Right here, this transition looks really bad, I think. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get black, but I'm going to have the opacity down really low on my brush. And again, you can change your opacity up at the top here. What that means is that that's only going to put down a portion of black on my design. So when I paint over it, you can see that it's only putting a little bit of that blur down and not like 100% changing it back to sharp. That can make the transition nice and smooth and look more believable. So there we go. We have a design where we are focusing on our middle ground, and our background and foreground are nice and blurry. Remember, our goal was to make it look like this, which that's not too bad of an attempt. Make sure that you respect any negative space, that you take your time, and I can kind of see that I needed to spend a little bit more time playing around this portion here on my camera strap, as well as there's a little bit of weirdness that's happening up here. But take your time, make sure that it looks nice, or take more time when you're taking pictures so that you can get a good shallow depth of field by affecting your aperture, if you can affect the aperture, by affecting the proximity by getting really close to whatever you're taking a picture of, or by affecting the focal length by having it a telephoto lens that's zoomed all the way in. When you're done, come up to File, and then you can come to Export and Save as JPEG.